Economists have cautiously welcomed the GDP reading, saying it reflects resilience amid global uncertainty. Macroeconomist and Managing Director at Kruthum, Attard Montalto, speaks to us about these developments. Thank you so much for your time this evening, Peter. How much of a gain does a 0.1% GDP reading represent in an economy such as South Africa?
Well, the resilience question, I think, sort of misses the point. This is far too weak to allow for any decent employment growth to have a dent in unemployment. Investments are going in the wrong direction. Investments as a share of GDP is actually falling back as opposed to rising as the government would like it to. And so, yes, in a very difficult world, it's maybe better than it otherwise could be. But this certainly is not growth that delivers anything the country particularly needs. And the recovery ultimately remains exceptionally uneven.
On the back of that, the near-term outlook, on the other hand, remains moderate. Is that a fair assessment given the domestic and global economic challenges?
Well, we have these countervailing forces. We have a lot of reform going on to logistics, to electricity, to water, to a whole load of other things that are going to take a long time really to feed through into higher potential growth that can lift growth maybe in the very long term up to, say, 2.5%. But that's probably 5 years or so out. And in the interim, we're going to have a glide higher. We're at 1% for full year growth this year, which actually implies a rise in the unemployment level versus last year. But at the same time, we have obviously a very uncertain global environment, huge volatility in terms of global sentiment, given what the US is doing on trade policy around tariffs, and generally a weaker global growth backdrop as well. So really, this is a push and pull between these longer-term positive factors and these shorter-term external negative factors.
What then is to be said about the views shared by global bodies, including the IMF and the World Bank, as they too have lowered South Africa's growth prospects?
So there is a tussle going on. I think it's interesting to think back to the start of this year where we were all talking about maybe quarterly growth in Q1 being 0.6, 0.7. That was revised heavily down then obviously this 1.1% print that came out today. And remember, people have come down from 2% expectations for full year growth this year. The IMF's now at 0.9. We're at 1%. Treasury was at 1.4% in budget 3.0 2 weeks ago. And really risks around our own forecast are probably marginally to the downside. It relies on a recovery in the second half of the year that could be at risk and is somewhat uncertain. So still, I think, from particularly Treasury, some further revisions down to go.
Speaking of Budget 3.0 and National Treasury, how can South Africa safeguard against the economic contraction, especially as the delayed budget saw that drop in sentiment around political and fiscal stability?
Well, there's a real tension going on here between potential downside in revenue collection because of lower growth versus a much more productive SARS. SARS has obviously been invested in. National Treasury putting in 7 billion into SARS over 3 years. And basically what we're seeing is that in our forecast, we're actually seeing less revenue underneath everything being collected by Treasury, by SARS, but then them doing a better job at that in a low growth environment. So we don't necessarily massively disagree with Treasury's revenue numbers, despite having a weaker growth outlook. But it's this tension that's hardly ideal. Ultimately, you would far rather be thinking about revenue surprising on the upside as opposed to wondering if it's going to surprise on the downside.
Thank you, as always, for your contribution, macroeconomist and Managing Director at Kruthum, Attard Montalto, adding to reaction on South Africa's economic growth after that first quarter 0.1% GDP uptick.